August 14, 2026, Western Pacific, 12:03 local time. The Philippine Sea is flat enough to look like polished steel, and the USS Ronald Reagan sits in the middle of it like a city dropped from orbit. 1,092 feet of flight deck, 100,000 tons of mass, 4 acres of runway, and roughly 5,000 people stacked inside a moving machine that costs more than the GDP of some countries. On deck, an F-35C Lightning II is chained to Catapult 2. Canopy down, pilot breathing oxygen, engines at idle, jet fuel shimmering in the heat haze. The ship is doing 25 knots into a 12-knot natural wind, creating 37 knots of wind over the deck, the exact number needed to throw 70,000 pounds of aircraft into the air with margin. And from 500 miles away, an adversary's coastal intelligence center watches the scene through a different kind of lens. They are not looking at the jet. They are looking at the sun. High noon means maximum illumination, maximum contrast, minimum shadow. It is the cleanest optical picture you can buy in physics. If you want to find a carrier, noon is when the ocean betrays it. If you want to time a satellite pass, noon is when the geometry lines up. If you want to cue missiles, noon is when every sensor is at its most confident. To enemy analysts, this looks like American arrogance made visible, a perfect moment to take a picture, build a firing solution, and tell themselves the carrier is finally vulnerable. But they're wrong, and not just wrong in theory. They're wrong in a way that gets people killed. Because when the U.S. Navy avoids launching its real carrier strikes at noon, it isn't superstition, and it isn't tradition. It's applied physics, operational art, and survival mathematics. Today we decode the hidden logic of why the most normal time of day is the worst time to show your hand. From the enemy's perspective, the logic of attacking a carrier during midday operations feels airtight. In the modern ocean, a carrier isn't found by one sensor. It's found by a chain. Satellites for wide area search, high-altitude drones for persistent track, electronic intelligence for emissions geolocation, and then a weapon that can close the last 100 miles faster than a ship can change the math. China's anti-ship ballistic missile problem set is built around exactly this chain. The DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile, NATO designation CSS-5 Mod 5, is advertised as a carrier killer with a range publicly reported in the neighborhood of 1,500 kilometers. Pair that with a DF-236 intermediate-range ballistic missile, often described in open sources as having a range up to around 4,000 kilometers, and you've got a weapon family that, on paper, turns the Western Pacific into a shooting gallery. The missile is only the last link. The real weapon is the targeting loop, and noon makes that loop easier. Optical satellites live for light. Synthetic aperture radar satellites can see through cloud, but optical imagery gives the human brain something radar never will: instant recognition. A carrier's angled deck, the island structure, the shadow lines of parked aircraft, the wake shape, the escorts in formation. Noon strips away ambiguity. It reduces the ocean's visual noise and increases the target's certainty. If you are an analyst trying to prove to your leadership that you've located the carrier, the cleanest images come when the sun is high and the ocean's glare and shadow fall into predictable patterns, a phenomenon related to specular reflection that space agencies openly call sunglint, where sunlight reflects off the water into a sensor, sometimes turning the sea into a mirror, and sometimes outlining objects with unnatural clarity depending on geometry source. That's why, in enemy war rooms, the clock on the wall matters as much as the range rings on the map. Now add the range math that makes commanders feel invincible. Let's put the carrier 900 nautical miles from an adversary coastline, a distance commanders might choose in a high-threat environment, far enough to feel safe, close enough to generate sorties. A DF-21 D-class threat with roughly 1,500 kilometers of reach is about 802 nautical miles. A DF-26 class threat with around 4,000 kilometers of reach is about 2,160 nautical miles. Do the math. 2,160 nautical miles of theoretical reach minus 900 nautical miles of carrier standoff equals 1,260 nautical miles of margin. That margin is the enemy's psychological comfort. It means they believe the carrier can be held at risk almost anywhere it can still influence the fight. And the cost comparison seems to favor the attacker so hard it feels like destiny. Even if a ballistic missile costs tens of millions of dollars, it is still pocket change compared to a carrier that is routinely described in the $13 billion class before you even count the aircraft, the escorts, and the strategic weight of the platform. For the cost of a single modern missile, you are gambling for a payoff that reshapes geopolitics. On paper, it looks like checkmate. Find the carrier at midday. Track it with persistent sensors, transmit coordinates, launch, and let physics do the rest. Beijing's analysts believe the carrier's flight operations at noon create a predictable pattern. Aircraft clustered forward, deck cycle rhythm, escorts locked into a protective geometry, the carrier committed to wind direction for catapult shots. They believe the ocean turns into a stage at noon and the carrier is forced to step into the spotlight. History doesn't calm that fear, it reinforces it. Naval aviation has always had to fight the tyranny of daylight. In World War II, when carriers launched major strikes, the enemy's first defensive advantage was simply seeing them coming. As sensors evolved, the advantage shifted from eyesight to radar to satellites, but the underlying truth remained. The moment you reveal your intent, you give the other side a target, and noon is the loudest reveal. Even without satellites, midday operations create a signature stack that can be sensed from far away. The surge of radio traffic as airborne assets check in, the increase in radar activity as air controllers manage deconfliction, the predictable course changes into the wind, the thermal signature of engines running on deck, and the visible evidence that an air wing is about to do something important. If you're an enemy commander, the temptation is obvious. Wait until noon, when optical tracking is easiest, and strike during the launch window, when aircraft are concentrated, fuel lines are active, and the deck is crowded. The weapon doesn't even have to sink the carrier to win. A few impacts that crater the deck or start aviation fuel fires can shut down flight operations, which is equivalent to removing the carrier from the fight. That's the enemy's calculus, and it feels terrifyingly rational. What they don't see is that the Navy has already treated noon as a liability for decades, and it has built a layered architecture that turns that liability into a trap by operating its real combat rhythm in the shadows and using noon as misdirection. Before the enemy satellite even reaches its midday pass, before the optical analyst zooms in and circles the carrier with a red pen, the invisible war has already begun, and it begins with something most people don't think of as a weapon: the electromagnetic calendar. Before the enemy tries to see the carrier, the U.S. strike group is already shaping what the enemy is allowed to know. The core system that makes this possible isn't a single radar or a single jammer. It's a doctrine called emission control, EMSCON, the disciplined management of what you radiate into the world. People imagine modern navies constantly blasting radar like a lighthouse. In reality, in a contested environment, the carrier strike group becomes something closer to a predator in tall grass. It can see without shining. It can communicate without shouting. It can coordinate without painting a giant arrow that says, "We are here." The physics is brutally simple. Every transmission is a photon you throw into the ocean of space, and photons travel at the speed of light in straight lines, which means someone far away can measure them, time them, and draw a line back to you. In old naval warfare, that meant a radar could be detected and its bearing plotted. In modern warfare, it means an enemy can do time difference of arrival geolocation across multiple sensors, triangulate emissions, and build an evolving track without ever seeing the ship. That's why noon matters. Midday conditions are often when adversaries schedule the most reliable optical confirmation, and optical confirmation is what collapses uncertainty into a firing solution. If your emissions have already hinted at where you are, noon is when they try to lock the picture in place. The U.S. Navy's counter is to make the enemy's certainty decay, and this is where the invisible war becomes a physics problem. The ocean is not a flat surface in an information sense. It is a curved, moving, reflective, noisy environment. Radar energy bends slightly in the atmosphere depending on temperature and humidity. Optical clarity shifts with haze and sea salt aerosol. Radio propagation changes with ducting layers. The Navy exploits that. But the deeper exploit is that it turns its own sensors into a distributed, low observable network rather than a single beacon. The aircraft that best embodies this isn't the carrier itself, it's the F-35C Lightning II. Its ANAPG-81 active electronically scanned array radar can operate in modes designed to reduce probability of intercept, meaning it can search and track while emitting in patterns that are harder for adversary receivers to detect and classify. This is not magic invisibility, it's signal processing and waveform design. Old radars were predictable metronomes. Modern radars can be more like whispers inside a crowded room, spread spectrum, frequency agile, designed to blend into background noise. This isn't old-school radar warfare role. This is spectrum engineering. Now stack that with the aircraft that turns spectrum engineering into an offensive act. The EA-18G Growler, the Navy's dedicated electronic attack platform. When it carries modern jamming pods and works in concert with shipboard electronic warfare suites, the enemy's perception of time and position becomes a manipulated variable. The adversary operator doesn't experience this as jamming the way movies show it. He experiences it as data that won't settle, tracks that drift, bearings that wobble, a picture that refuses to become crisp. And at noon, that matters more than at any other time because noon is when the enemy tries to turn a probabilistic track into a photograph. The Chinese operator sees a satellite downlinked cue that suggests a carrier is within a certain box of ocean, maybe 60 by 60 nautical miles, based on prior emissions and motion modeling. He expects the noon pass to collapse that box into a precise dot, where the strike group has been shaping the box for hours. It has used directional communications. It has shifted who transmits and when. It has forced the enemy to chase an information wake rather than a ship wake. The operator watches his screen and thinks the carrier is approaching a certain point because the last emissions suggested that course. Then the confirmation arrives and the ship isn't where the model predicted. It's offset by 20 miles. Not enough to lose it forever, but enough to force another pass, another delay, another cycle of uncertainty. And uncertainty is lethal to the attacker because missiles do not home on guesses. Missiles home on tracks. The enemy never saw it coming because they assumed the carrier's schedule was about convenience. It's not. It's about controlling the enemy's timing chain. To understand why noon is avoided for real strikes, you have to understand how a carrier's most basic act-launching aircraft becomes a sensor flare visible across domains. The public sees dramatic footage of jets being catapulted, and the Navy does release official video of flight operations that shows how busy and exposed the deck looks in daylight source. But in war, the launch itself is not the loud part. The loud part is everything around it. The comms surge, the radar management, the escort repositioning, the predictable requirement to turn into the wind. A carrier cannot launch fixed-wing aircraft at any heading. It must generate wind over deck. If the natural wind is low, it must create it by speed. That constrains maneuver, and a constrained maneuver at noon is a gift to anyone trying to predict where you'll be 10 minutes from now. That's why the first layer of defense isn't a missile. It's time discipline. It's making sure that when you do something that forces you into predictable geometry, you do it when the enemy's best sensors are at their worst. But suppose the enemy doesn't need a perfect optical picture. Suppose they decide noon isn't about seeing. It's about striking during maximum deck vulnerability. Suppose their weapon is not an anti-ship ballistic missile but a long-range maritime strike package. A salvo of supersonic cruise missiles launched from bombers or submarines, timed to arrive during the carrier's launch cycle when aircraft are crowded forward and fueling operations are active. This is where the second layer appears, and it's a layer most people misunderstand because it's easy to romanticize. The Navy doesn't rely on darkness as concealment. Darkness is not a blanket. Darkness is a tool, and the tool is fused to technology that turns night operations from risky improvisation into routine math. The key is that the U.S. Navy is comfortable launching and recovering aircraft in low light because its landing and approach systems are designed for it. A carrier's landing environment is controlled by an ecosystem of lighting, precision guidance, and instrument procedures that allow pilots to fly approaches that are less dependent on visual cues than civilian audiences assume. The Joint Precision Approach and Landing System, JPALS, is a GPS-based precision landing capability designed to provide highly accurate guidance in all weather conditions, including low visibility. Pair that with modern carrier approach procedures and a flight deck designed for controlled lighting, and you get an operational reality where twilight and night are not barriers, they're advantages. This isn't the old paradigm of needing daylight to fly safely. This is the new reality of instrument-driven carrier aviation where the ship can choose the lighting conditions that best deny the enemy. Now, at the physics of seekers. Many modern anti-ship cruise missiles use active radar seekers in terminal phase, and some incorporate infrared or imaging infrared modes to improve discrimination. Noon complicates their job less than you'd think. The ocean at noon can be both bright and cluttered depending on sea state, but infrared discrimination is influenced by thermal contrast. At noon, the deck heats up, metal structures bake. The temperature difference between the carrier and the surrounding sea can shift. At night, the sea surface cools differently than the ship's mass. Thermal gradients change. Background clutter changes. A seeker trying to pick out a ship against the ocean is doing pattern recognition in a physics environment. The Navy wants that environment to be hostile to the attacker. That is one reason major launch events lean into dawn, dusk, and night. It's not because the Navy can't operate at noon. It's because the enemy can. But suppose the threat survives that advantage. Suppose the enemy chooses a weapon that ignores optical conditions and relies on radar and speed. Imagine a salvo of P-800 Onyx supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, NATO designation SSN-26 Strobile, a weapon class that flies at Mach 2+ and can skim the sea in terminal phase. Or imagine the Russian 3 main 5-4 Kalibor family in an anti-ship configuration with terminal sprint behavior that compresses reaction time. The enemy believes noon is the ideal time because the carrier is busy, because deck cycles create predictable windows, because human attention is split. They believe they can use that split-second chaos. And this is where the third layer arrives, the fact that a carrier strike group is not a carrier. It is a moving air defense network that treats every inbound missile as a geometry problem that can be solved by distributed sensors and cooperative fire control. The heart of that layer is the Aegis combat system, the integrated radar and weapon architecture carried by cruisers and destroyers that escort the carrier. In modern strike groups, those escorts are not decorative. They are the outer shell of a defensive bubble, and they do not operate independently. They operate as part of a sensor network that can share data in real time. Cooperative Engagement Capability, CEC, is a system designed to allow multiple platforms to share sensor data and enable one unit to engage a target based on another unit's tracking information source. That means the carrier does not have to see the missile first to survive it. The destroyer 40 miles away might see it first. The airborne early warning aircraft might see it first. The fighter on patrol might see it first. The network turns first detection into shared truth, and shared truth compresses reaction time. Here's the physics that makes this a midnight weapon, not a midday weapon. Radar horizon is a function of altitude and Earth curvature. The sea-skimming missile is hard to see at long range because it hides behind curvature until it is close. But an aircraft at altitude sees farther because its horizon is farther. An E-2D Advanced Hawkeye, the Navy's airborne early warning and battle management aircraft, carries the ANACP-9 radar and can monitor a huge volume of airspace while coordinating engagements. It is the strike group's high-altitude sensor anchor. If the enemy times a missile salvo to arrive at noon, the Hawkeye's radar performance is not degraded by sunlight. Radar does not care about noon. The Hawkeye sees the inbound raid as a set of tracks, and those tracks are pushed into the strike group's combat system. The enemy expects noon to impose chaos. The network imposes order. But suppose the threat isn't a cruise missile. Suppose it's the weapon that makes noon feel most dangerous. An anti-ship ballistic missile descending at hypersonic speed, compressing the final engagement into seconds. Suppose the enemy's kill chain uses midday optical confirmation to cue that ballistic shot, and the missile arcs into space and falls back toward the ocean at Mach 10+. This is where people assume night doesn't matter because the missile doesn't need light. But the Navy's defensive concept still makes noon the wrong time for the attacker, because noon is when the attacker believes the carrier is most predictable, and predictability is the currency required for ballistic engagement. Ballistic missiles don't steer like cruise missiles. They can maneuver in limited ways in terminal phase, but their power is speed and geometry. To hit a moving carrier, the attacker must not only know where the carrier is now, they must know where it will be when the warhead arrives. That means the attacker's targeting data must be fresh, and their model of carrier motion must be accurate. Noon is when they attempt to refresh that model with optical certainty. The Navy's answer is to ensure that when the attacker gets their certainty, it is already stale. The carrier's operational rhythm is designed so that the most predictable, constrained behaviors happen in windows that minimize the enemy's ability to update the track with high-confidence confirmation. The big cyclic launches, the ones that put a large package of aircraft in the air to do something real, lean into darkness, because darkness reduces the quality and availability of the enemy's easiest confirmation method. This isn't old naval romanticism about the night being safer. This is the new reality. That in an era of satellites, the only true stealth is timing. Now, we get to the visceral part, because the fourth layer is what happens if the enemy still takes the shot. If the missile still comes, if the strike group still has to swat physics out of the sky. This is the layer where the Navy stops being subtle and starts being violent, and it is also where the cost comparison flips so hard it becomes a strategic message. If an anti-ship ballistic missile is detected early in its flight, the strike group's intercept window shifts from seconds to minutes. That early detection can come from space-based infrared sensors that see the rocket motor bloom at launch from long-range radar systems and from the strike group's own sensors. Once the track is established, an Aegis ship can employ interceptors designed for ballistic missile defense. In open discussion, the Standard Missile family is often associated with this role, with variants designed for different parts of the engagement. The physics of a hit-to-kill intercept are what make this layer so terrifying to the attacker. Hit-to-kill means the interceptor doesn't rely on a high explosive blast to destroy the target. It relies on velocity. That is not a marketing phrase. It is thermodynamics and momentum turned into a weapon. When two objects collide at combined speeds that can exceed tens of thousands of miles per hour, the energy at the impact point is so intense that materials stop behaving like solids. They transition. They flash into plasma. They cease to exist as objects and become expanding debris fields in vacuum. This is not cinematic exaggeration. It's what happens when kinetic energy is applied at hypersonic closure rates. This is the paradigm shift modern navies live inside. This isn't old-school air defense where you throw shrapnel into the sky and hope. This is a precision collision in near space where you turn Newton's laws into annihilation. And notice what that does to the attacker's cost logic. The attacker thinks in exchange ratios. A missile might cost a fraction of the carrier's price. But the defender's interceptors are not free either, and that's where the attacker tells themselves they can win by saturation. Yet saturation depends on a kill chain that can keep feeding accurate tracks. If the Navy denies that chain by shifting major launch activity into darkness, it doesn't just make the missile harder to hit, it makes the missile harder to justify. Because now, the attacker must spend more missiles for less confidence. If a defensive interceptor costs millions, the attacker must spend missiles that also cost millions to have a chance of getting one through. Meanwhile, the carrier's aircraft, the actual combat power, already airborne, already dispersed, already operating in the battlespace. The attacker's salvo becomes an attempt to hit an aircraft carrier that has turned itself into a moving command node rather than a fixed aviation parking lot. This is not the old paradigm where you sink the ship and the air power dies with it. This is the new reality where a carrier's sortie generation and its strike package timing can be engineered to ensure the air wing is in the air when the enemy thinks the ship is most vulnerable. This is also where noon becomes psychologically dangerous for the attacker. Noon tempts them into thinking the carrier is forced into predictability. They believe they can attack when the ship must turn into wind, when aircraft are staged, when the deck is crowded, when operations are visible. But the Navy uses noon as a decoy window. It can run routine cycles, training cycles, maintenance cycles, cycles that look important on a satellite photo but do not represent a decisive operation. Meanwhile, the real strike, the one that matters, is timed to a different clock, often anchored to the edges of daylight, where the enemy's easiest confirmation tools degrade. The enemy sees a noon launch and thinks, finally, the Americans are doing what we can see. And that belief is a weapon the Navy uses against them. The Chinese analyst watches a midday image and believes the carrier is preparing a major strike because aircraft are on deck. He believes the launch window is imminent, so he cues surveillance assets and prepares to respond. But the strike group's real cycle already happened hours earlier. The aircraft he sees are the leftovers, the respots, the decoys. The real package is already 300 miles away at altitude, coordinated by airborne command and control, and the enemy's defensive posture is now pointed at the wrong moment. At this point, the question becomes unavoidable, and it's the question taxpayers ask, the question politicians ask, the question even some military commentators ask when they see a carrier operating in contested waters. Why build a system so dependent on timing and risk? Why not simply make noon irrelevant by staying farther away? Why not keep the carrier at 1,500 miles, well outside threat envelopes, and launch long-range aircraft from Sanctuary? The answer is the same answer that drives every uncomfortable decision in war. Time is life, and distance is blood. To make that concrete, stop thinking about the carrier as a ship and start thinking about it as an emergency room that can move. The ship's position and its launch timing are not chosen solely for combat effectiveness. They are chosen for casualty survival. Every minute you save in response time is a minute you subtract from a human body's countdown. A Marine or sailor hit in a high-intensity fight is not living in a cinematic world where heroic grit keeps him alive. He is living inside a biological equation. A severed artery doesn't care about national strategy. A collapsed lung doesn't care about political messaging. And medevac timelines are not flexible. They are physics and physiology. The concept most people have heard of is the golden hour, the critical window after traumatic injury during which rapid surgical intervention dramatically increases survival. But the golden hour is often misquoted as a gentle guideline. In practice, it is a hard boundary. A catastrophic hemorrhage can kill in minutes. A tension pneumothorax can kill in less than 10 if untreated. Shock cascades through a body on a clock the victim cannot slow down. If a casualty needs surgery, not bandages, then the difference between a carrier being 120 nautical miles away versus 220 nautical miles away is the difference between arriving in time versus arriving to pronounce. That's why a carrier's operational decisions are anchored in response time mathematics. It's also why noon matters. Noon operations stress the humans who make that response possible. Consider the flight deck at noon. In many operating areas, the deck temperature can exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit under direct sun. Metal surfaces absorb heat. The deck becomes a radiant heat plate. Flight deck crews work in heavy gear, cranials, goggles, float coats, hearing protection, steel toe boots. The human body becomes a limiting factor. Heat stress doesn't announce itself with drama. It arrives as slowed reaction time, reduced fine motor control, increased error probability, and on a flight deck, error probability kills. The Navy trains for night operations not because night is romantic, but because night can be operationally safer for the humans who must execute violent precision under stress. This isn't the old paradigm where daylight equals safety and night equals danger. This is the new reality where daylight can degrade human performance in ways that matter more than darkness does. Now tie that to launch timing as a combat decision. A strike package isn't just jets taking off. It's a choreography of fueling, arming, spotting, catapult sequencing, deconfliction, and command and control. The ship's air department runs on cycles. Those cycles are engineered to generate maximum sortie rate while managing risk. And in a contested environment, those cycles are also engineered to shape the enemy's perception. Noon is when the enemy expects the biggest, cleanest show, so the Navy shifts the decisive moves to the margins of light. That shift does two things simultaneously. It denies easy enemy confirmation, and it preserves human performance. When you launch a major package at 4:30 instead of 12:30, you are choosing an operating environment where deck crews are cooler, less fatigued by heat, less blinded by glare, and more able to execute precise signals and movements. You are also choosing an environment where enemy optical tracking is degraded and their timeline to build confidence is compressed. And here's where the moral dimension comes in. Because all of us talk about sensors and missiles can make it feel abstract. It is not. There is a reason the Navy cares about minutes. Imagine a casualty on the ground, a pilot down, a special operations team pinned, someone who needs extraction. The carrier's aircraft are the fastest way to deliver suppression, cover, and rescue. If your strike package is delayed because you chose a safe noon schedule that was easier for the enemy to track and contest, that delay turns into blood loss. If your deck crew makes a mistake because heat and glare degraded performance, that mistake becomes a crash, a fire, a body. If your carrier must suspend operations at noon because of an inbound threat that was easier for the enemy to time and cue, that suspension becomes a gap in coverage that someone on the ground pays for. The cost comparison here isn't just missiles versus ships, it's time versus lives. A carrier air wing can launch 2 aircraft in rapid sequence, and the Navy's own public demonstrations of advanced launch systems like the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System, EMALS, show how quickly a carrier can throw aircraft into the sky when the deck cycle is clean. Source. But that mechanical speed only matters if the schedule isn't disrupted by threat response. That's why the Navy treats noon like a trap. Noon is when the enemy wants to force disruption. If you avoid making your decisive moves at noon, you force the enemy into a harder problem, reacting to a strike that is already airborne, already coordinated, already moving, while their best confirmation sensors are degraded. This is where the humanization becomes unavoidable, and it belongs in the middle of the machinery, not as sentiment but as accountability. Inside the carrier's Combat Direction Center, tracking airspace, managing the strike group sensor picture, there is a 19-year-old from Florida standing watch, eyes flicking between symbols and numbers, wearing a headset, speaking in calm, clipped phrases because panic is contagious. He is not thinking about geopolitics. He is thinking about whether that unknown track is a civilian airliner or a maritime patrol aircraft or the opening move of a missile raid. His job is to keep the picture coherent so the ship can keep launching. And if you ask why the Navy refuses to give the enemy the easiest possible moment to collapse uncertainty, why it refuses to make noon the time when it commits to a big, visible, decisive launch, the answer is that the Navy doesn't schedule operations around comfort. It schedules them around preserving the chain of actions that keeps people alive. That chain has fixed overhead. It has reaction times. It has margins. It has failure points. And the Navy engineers the clock to reduce those failure points when it matters most. Let's put numbers on that moral logic. If a rescue helicopter or tiltrotor aircraft must launch to extract a casualty, there is fixed overhead for spin-up, deck clearance, team preparation, and launch. If that overhead is 15 minutes, and the casualty has a 60-minute survivability window for certain trauma types without surgical intervention, you have 45 minutes of travel time. If the rescue aircraft cruises at 240 knots, that's 4 nautical miles per minute, meaning 45 minutes gives you 180 nautical miles in ideal conditions. But ideal conditions do not exist in combat. You need margin for weather, routing, threat avoidance, and the chaos of real extraction, so the effective radius shrinks. That's why carriers position themselves at distances that look risky but are mathematically necessary, not 180 miles, not 250. Often something closer to 120, sometimes less depending on the mission, and that positioning interacts with launch timing. If your carrier must turn into the wind at noon in a predictable way, you may be forced to accept vulnerability at exactly the wrong time. So the Navy aligns the major launch windows with times that reduce enemy ability to cue and strike during that predictable geometry. That's why the ship is at 120 nautical miles from the objective area. Not 119, not 121, exactly 120, because that distance preserves the response timeline while allowing the strike group to shape its launch and recovery windows away from the enemy's easiest targeting moment. Now pull back, because the hidden logic is not night is safer. The hidden logic is that a carrier strike group is a networked organism that uses time as a defensive layer. Noon isn't avoided because it's cursed. Noon is avoided because noon is when the enemy's multi-domain kill chain is most efficient at closing uncertainty. The Navy's answer is to keep uncertainty alive for the enemy while keeping certainty alive for itself. Here is what that architecture looks like when you see it as a single system instead of isolated capabilities. The carrier is the visible node. It is the runway, the fuel depot, the weapons magazine, the command post. The escorts are the air defense shell using Aegis combat system-equipped ships to provide long-range detection and engagement. The airborne early warning aircraft, the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye, is the high-altitude sensor and coordinator, managing tracks and deconfliction while feeding the strike group a shared picture. The electronic attack aircraft, the EA-18 Driller, shapes the enemy's perception, manipulating radar and communication pathways so the enemy sees what the strike group wants them to see. The stealth fighters, like the F-35C, extend sensing and targeting forward while reducing the need for the strike group to radiate loudly. All of it is tied together by tactical data links, the kind of real-time connectivity that CEC is designed to enable, where sensor data can be shared and fire control solutions can be supported across platforms. Source: this isn't a single weapon. This is a networked system, and like any network system, it can use scheduling as a form of defense. Because the enemy's kill chain is also a network, it begins with detection, then classification, then tracking, then targeting, then engagement, then assessment. Noon compresses their detection and classification steps because optical sensing is easiest. The Navy's time strategy is to make those steps fail or slow down by shifting decisive activity into windows when optical sensing is degraded. Dawn and dusk are not just pretty times of day. They are transition zones where contrast shifts rapidly, shadows lengthen, and the atmosphere can introduce more haze. Night removes optical certainty altogether, unless the adversary has specialized night-capable sensors, and even then, the quality changes. The Navy doesn't rely on night alone. It uses night plus econ plus electronic warfare plus distributed sensing to keep its own picture sharp while blurring the enemy's. And the brilliance is that this time strategy doesn't just defend, it attacks. If the enemy wants to strike at noon because they believe you are vulnerable during flight operations and you refuse to give them that vulnerability window, you force them into either taking shots with less confidence or holding fire until they can confirm. Holding fire is a choice that gives you time. It gives you time to strike their sensors, to reposition, to launch your own weapons, to break their chain. In modern warfare, time is not neutral. Time is the medium in which kill chains live. If you stretch the enemy's time, you strangle their kill chain. That's the hidden logic. Now imagine the adversary commander who thinks he has finally found the carrier at noon. He watches a noon pass, sees a large deck, escorts in formation, aircraft on deck. He believes he has a clean confirmation. He transmits the coordinates. He cues launch. But the strike group's real combat package launched at 4:30 used the darkness to reduce detection and is now approaching his coastal defenses from an unexpected direction. The missiles he launches toward the carrier are already chasing a moving deception. The carrier may even choose to conduct visible noon operations precisely to encourage this belief, to pull the enemy into spending their best shot at the wrong time. This is not old-school deception with wooden ships and fake radio traffic. This is modern deception, where you exploit the enemy's dependence on multi-domain confirmation, and you use their own desire for certainty as a lure. And if the enemy still escalates, if they push beyond sensor war into kinetic war, the network defense becomes a cage. The outer layer engages threats at long range with interceptors guided by shared sensor data. The mid-layer engages leakers with point defense missiles. The inner layer uses close-in weapon systems and last-ditch defenses. But the more important point is that the carrier's timing choices influence how effective those layers are. If the enemy can time their attack to coincide with your most predictable maneuvering, your defensive geometry becomes harder. If you shift your predictable windows away from their best sensor windows, you make their timing harder. That's why the Navy rarely gives noon the honor of being the decisive moment. Noon is when you let them watch. Dawn is when you move. This isn't the old paradigm of hide the ship that died when space became the high ground. This is the new reality of hide the decision. You don't need to be invisible. You need to be unpredictable at the moments that matter. You can let the enemy see you at noon and still win as long as what they see is not what you are doing. That is the heart of modern carrier warfare. The carrier is both a weapon and a decoy, both a runway and a baited hook, both a signal and a mask. It also explains why noon footage feels so common to the public. Official Navy videos often show carrier flight operations in beautiful daylight because daylight footage is dramatic and clear, and it communicates readiness. Source: that public-facing visibility can trick audiences into thinking daylight is the Navy's preferred combat condition. It's not. The Navy is comfortable at night. It trains for night, because night is when the enemy's easiest confirmation tools falter. If you want to understand why carriers never launch at noon, you have to interpret the phrase correctly. It doesn't mean a jet will never be catapulted at 1200. It means the Navy does not schedule its decisive combat launch, the strike that matters. The one that opens a campaign, the one that relies on surprise, the one that must survive enemy reaction at the time when the enemy's information advantage is at its peak. Now return to the paradox at the beginning. A carrier at high noon looks exposed. It looks like a billboard. It looks like the one time of day where the ocean gives no mercy. To an enemy analyst, the sun is a gift. To a Navy planner, the sun is a weapon that can be pointed both ways. The carrier doesn't fear noon. It controls noon. It uses noon as a visible rhythm while it keeps the real rhythm hidden. The adversary thinks noon is when they can see the most, so noon is when the Navy can feed them the most convincing lies. The adversary thinks noon is when the carrier must be predictable, so noon is when the carrier can afford to be visible precisely because the decisive action has already happened. And that brings us back to the human cost, the part that makes this more than a chess problem. That 19-year-old from Florida on watch isn't just managing tracks. He's managing minutes. He's ensuring the ship can keep launching when someone on the ground needs help, when a pilot needs a tanker, when a destroyer needs an intercept queue, when a helicopter needs a safe corridor. The Navy's timing doctrine is a way to keep that chain unbroken, because the only thing worse than being targeted is being forced to stop operating. The carrier that avoids noon for decisive launches is not being cautious, it is being aggressive in a smarter direction. It is choosing to fight the enemy where the enemy is weak, in the gaps between satellite passes, in the uncertainty of twilight, in the degraded confidence of low light, in the electromagnetic ambiguity created by disciplined emissions and electronic attack. It is choosing to make the enemy spend time. And in modern warfare, spending time is bleeding opportunity. So when you hear the phrase, the U.S. Navy never launches carriers at noon, understand it as an operational truth disguised as a meme. The Navy doesn't worship the night. It weaponizes the clock. It treats noon as a predictable sensor advantage for the enemy. And it refuses to schedule the decisive move when the enemy's sensors are smiling. This isn't a threat. This is a geometry and physics demonstration where sunlight, curvature of the Earth, waveform design, thermal gradients, and networked fire control all collide into one conclusion. Timing is a layer of defense as real as steel and missiles. Remove one piece of the architecture and the structure weakens. Remove the airborne early warning and you lose your eyes. Remove the electronic attack and you lose your ability to shape perception. Remove the data links, and you lose the shared picture that makes cooperative defense possible. But with the network intact and the clock chosen deliberately, you have a cage the enemy cannot escape. Because every time they try to close certainty, you move the decision into shadow and let their confidence starve. August 14th, 2029, 12:02 local time. The USS Ronald Reagan is still there in the sunlight, still launching an aircraft, still looking like a target to anyone who doesn't understand the deeper pattern. But the real strike, the one the enemy will remember, didn't begin at noon. It began when the horizon was still black, when the sea and sky were indistinguishable, when the only lights on deck were controlled and purposeful, when the enemy's satellites couldn't give them a clean answer, and when a carrier strike group used the oldest ally in warfare, darkness, not as romance, but as math. Not 1159, not 12,001. Exactly 12,001's you to commit. And that's precisely why you don't. The sun doesn't decide the battle. The schedule does. The physics don't negotiate. The chain holds. If this changed the way you see carrier warfare and the idea of stealth in the satellite age, type shadows in the comments and tell me what time of day you think the most dangerous strike in history actually launched.